Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my channel. Let me ask you something that you may never have dared to say out loud. Have you ever felt a strange shift in the atmosphere, right in the middle of your most intimate, sacred moments with your spouse? Not guilt, not shame, but the presence. Something unspoken, like eyes watching, a soft hush in the air that doesn't belong. And maybe, just maybe, you brushed it off. Because we don't talk about these things. Not in church, not in counseling, not even in marriage retreats. But what if I told you that you're not imagining it? What if ancient texts, Christian traditions, and spiritual wisdom across the ages have warned us, softly, mysteriously but consistently, that the union between a husband and wife is not only deeply physical, emotional, and spiritual, but also visible to those beyond the veil? In this video, we're going to gently and honestly explore what it really means to be spiritually exposed during intimacy. We'll talk about Jinn. Yes, those spiritual beings found in ancient Abrahamic traditions, and what Christian teachings might say about their awareness, their gaze, and their boundaries. This is not about fear, it's about intimacy, spiritual protection, and the sacredness of your bedroom. So grab a warm cup of something comforting, because we're going deep into a conversation no one else is having, but everyone should. Let's take a breath together. You've had a long day. Perhaps you've been carrying the weight of responsibilities, commitments, schedules, and the quiet longing for connection that you haven't quite been able to put into words. Now imagine the moment you finally come home. You shut the door behind you, and for the first time today, you're not somebody's employee or boss or parent or fixer. You're just you. And maybe you catch the eyes of your partner. Maybe there's a glance, a signal, a longing. That sacred language of lovers that doesn't need translation. Intimacy in the context of a committed marriage is not just sex. It's the alchemy of two souls choosing to become one flesh, again and again, in the mystery of sacred love. But here's a question no one's asking at your church service, and certainly not over brunch with friends. Are you ever truly alone in those moments? I'm not talking about metaphor. I'm not talking about God watching you like a divine surveillance camera. I'm talking about the possibility that something else might be present. Now, before you click away, thinking this is superstition or paranoia, I want you to stay with me. Because if we're honest, most of us have had moments in our private lives that felt off. Not wrong, not even sinful, just disturbed, distracted, suddenly distant, as if the emotional and spiritual atmosphere of the room shifted. Maybe it was a flicker of light, a sudden chill, or an unexplained tension right before a moment of closeness. Maybe your spouse suddenly turned cold, or you felt a presence that couldn't be seen. You may have chalked it up to stress, hormones, fatigue, or mood. But what if there's something spiritual about what you're sensing? In Christian theology, and even more so in the deeper layers of Middle Eastern and Semitic traditions, there's this idea, this unsettling awareness, that intimacy is not always as private as we assume, that there are spiritual beings who watch, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your union is powerful, sacred, and anything sacred draws attention. In the Islamic tradition, they're called Jinn. In the Old Testament, they're the Shedim or the unclean spirits. In Christian understanding, we might refer to them as demons or even simply spirits, beings without flesh yet deeply aware of human activity, especially activities charged with life force like sex. But don't let that word, Jinn, scare you or make you feel like we've left the Christian world behind. The Jinn are mentioned in the Quran, yes, but the Bible speaks of them in different language. In Ephesians 6, Paul tells us we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. What do you think those forces are attracted to? Boredom, gossip, or moments of divine connection that echo Eden? You see, sex in marriage is holy, and wherever holiness exists, there are boundaries that must be guarded. Not just emotional boundaries, not just physical ones, but spiritual boundaries. Have you ever considered that the act of love is a portal? That when you and your spouse connect in body, something happens in the spiritual realm that echoes far beyond your bedroom walls. That's not poetic hyperbole. That's not fantasy. That's the deeply spiritual nature of our design. The Bible says in Genesis that when man and woman come together, they become one flesh. It doesn't say they feel close. It says they become one. That language is not metaphor. It's metaphysical. It means something actually shifts. And if it shifts in the physical, it surely echoes in the unseen. Which brings us to a delicate but crucial question. What else is in the room when you and your spouse are naked and not ashamed? What if, in your most vulnerable moments, the enemy tries to sow seeds of shame, anxiety, or distraction, not because you're doing something wrong, but because he's terrified of what your union represents? The Jinn or demons or spirits or principalities, whatever language you prefer, are not omniscient. They're not God. They don't see all, but they are ancient. They are watchers. And when a marriage is strained, when connection is brittle, when communication is shallow and sex becomes mechanical, that's when they whisper. They whisper lies like, he's just using you. She doesn't desire you anymore. This is boring. This is duty, not love. And suddenly, what was meant to be sacred becomes shameful. Not because you've sinned, but because you've been intruded upon. The spiritual boundary was never reinforced. The gate was left open. Now, I know this is unsettling. And you might be wondering, what am I supposed to do with this information? Am I supposed to be afraid, suspicious? No, my love, not afraid, but aware. Just like you wouldn't invite a stranger to watch you share a moment of affection with your spouse in your kitchen, or read aloud your love letters to someone hiding under the bed, why would you leave your spiritual doors unlocked during the most intimate act of all? What I'm saying is intimacy is warfare. Not the kind of warfare you fight with swords, but the kind you protect with intention, with prayer, with covering. Have you ever prayed before intimacy? Not just for protection, but for unity, for joy, for divine presence. We bless our food, we bless our babies, we bless our homes. But when it comes to the marital bed, we stay silent as if it's somehow unspiritual. And yet in Hebrews 13:4, the Bible says, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. Why would it need to be undefiled if there were no risk of defilement? And let's be clear, defilement doesn't always look like porn or adultery. Sometimes it's simply allowing the wrong spirit in the room. Distraction, resentment, insecurity, fear. These are not just emotional glitches, they are spiritual disruptions. So what does it look like to reclaim your sacred space? It starts by acknowledging that your intimacy is worth protecting, that it's more than physical, that your union is a spiritual weapon, and like any weapon, it must be kept clean, sharp, and safe. You don't need candles or rituals. You need awareness. You need unity. And you need the kind of love that is strong enough to ask the hard questions. Have we invited God into our bedroom? Have we asked Him to guard our connection, not just in public, but in private? Have we been intentional about what energies, what attitudes, what spirits we allow into our sacred space? Because the truth is, the Jinn don't just watch with curiosity, they observe with intent. They look for weaknesses, emotional cracks, unforgiven wounds, lusts unspoken, and like mold in a dark corner, they thrive in secrecy. But light casts them out. Love disarms them. Prayer silences their whispers. So tonight, as you turn toward your spouse, whether in desire or simply in quiet companionship, I invite you to pause, to pray, to reclaim what has always belonged to you. Because what happens between two hearts, two souls and two bodies in covenant love should be seen only by God Himself. There's a kind of silence that lovers know, not the awkward kind, not the bored kind, but the holy kind. The silence that falls when two people see each other, truly see, and choose one another again, even after a long day, a harsh word, or a week of missed chances. That silence, it is not empty. It is full of decision, of grace, of mercy. But imagine for a moment that into that sacred pause something else whispers. Not a voice you can hear out loud, but a feeling, a shift. Suddenly, instead of leaning toward your partner, you find yourself mentally withdrawing. A small irritation rises. A comparison flashes through your mind. You question your desirability. You question their intention. The moment closes before it ever opens. And you think, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe we're not connecting. Maybe it's just us. But what if I told you that the greatest strategy of the spiritual realm isn't to tempt you into sin, it's to distract you from intimacy? Because the enemy knows something most couples forget, that intimacy is not just a reward for love, it is the engine of love. And this is where we have to get deeply honest. When you and your spouse come together, when bodies unite, when hearts beat against each other, when souls dance in quiet rhythm, it sends a frequency into the spiritual world, a frequency that affirms covenant, a frequency that declares we are still one, a frequency that terrifies anything built on division. The Jinn, the unclean spirits, they don't need to see naked skin to be alerted. They sense energy. They respond to unity like moths to a flame, not because they want to witness pleasure, but because they want to interrupt what it protects. So often in marriages, we struggle to understand why the passion fades, why the emotional connection weakens, why resentment builds after what should be closeness. We try therapy, we try date nights, we try scheduling sex, and those things can help. But what if what's stealing your intimacy is not just unmet expectations or tired routines? What if it's an invisible presence sowing tiny seeds of disconnection? What if you're not just fighting business or boredom or biology, but an agenda? You see, there's a spiritual pattern in how intimacy gets sabotaged. First, it starts with silence. Not the good kind, but the cold kind. The kind where communication slips into assumption. Then comes the delay. One partner is tired, the other feels rejected. No one wants to push too hard or seem needy. Then comes the narrative. Maybe he's not attracted to me anymore. She's always annoyed. This is becoming routine. And finally comes the counterfeit, external distraction, fantasy, comparison, shame, and emotional isolation. By the time you realize it, your sacred space has been invaded. You don't need to be possessed to be influenced. You just need to forget that intimacy is sacred, and it becomes vulnerable. In ancient times, Jewish and early Christian traditions both took great care with the marital bed. There were prayers of blessing, rituals of purification, not because sex was dirty, but because it was divine. Because every time a man and woman joined together in covenant, they were echoing the Garden of Eden. They were creating life. Even if no baby came from it, they were creating it, and unity is what the enemy fears most. When Paul said in 1 Corinthians that The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. He wasn't just talking about abstaining from sin. He was saying that even in our pleasure, even in our flesh, we are temples, and every temple must be protected. So how do you protect your temple? You begin by paying attention to the atmosphere. Do you feel peace in your bedroom? Do you sense honor, playfulness, trust? Or is there a lingering heaviness, a sense of strain, a pattern of withdrawal that has no clear source? Let me be clear. This is not about demon hunting behind every closed door. This is not about paranoia or guilt or turning pleasure into shame. This is about discernment. When something begins to chip away at your closeness and you've done all the right things, you've communicated, you've shown up, you've tried, and still there's a coldness. It's time to ask, is there something spiritual at play here? Because here's what most people miss. The Jinn are not always dramatic. They don't always throw plates or slam doors or cause nightmares. Sometimes they simply whisper, they feed the tension, they stir the insecurity, and if you don't recognize their interference, you will fight your spouse instead of fighting the real enemy. We were never meant to be naive about the spiritual realm. Jesus himself cast out spirits from those afflicted, some physically, others emotionally. And if Christ made a practice of acknowledging and dealing with spiritual interference, why would we ignore it in our most vulnerable spaces? One of the simplest, yet most powerful ways to guard your intimacy is through spoken blessing. Not a performance, not a recited chant, just a whisper of intention. Before you come together with your spouse, try this. Take a moment. Hold hands, look at each other, and pray, not for performance, not for excitement, not even for great chemistry. Pray for connection. Something like, Lord, we thank you for this covenant. We ask you to protect this moment from all distraction, all fear, all interference. Make our love a sanctuary. Let this be holy ground. Amen. It doesn't have to be long. It just has to be intentional. Because intentionality is what tells the spiritual world this union is not open for interruption. You are not helpless. You are not passive observers of your marriage. You are guardians of a holy space. And yes, sometimes that means putting down your devices earlier. Sometimes it means lighting a candle, playing music, setting the tone, not to perform, but to prepare. Because when your body and soul are about to touch something sacred, you prepare the atmosphere. Just as Moses removed his sandals before the burning bush because the ground was holy, we too must remove the distractions, the baggage, the unspoken resentments, and come with reverence. Not because sex is fragile, but because it's powerful. And wherever there is power, there is the potential for intrusion or for intimacy. I want you to know, if your intimacy has been feeling distant, strange, or disconnected, it doesn't mean your marriage is broken. It may mean that something precious is under spiritual pressure, but you don't need to fear. You don't need to perform. You simply need to reclaim what has always been yours. A union that is private, protected, and pulsing with the kind of love that makes the enemy tremble. Because love is not just chemistry, it is a covering. And when two hearts are covered in prayer, trust, and desire, even the Jinn have no place to stand. There's something beautiful that happens when a couple begins to take back their space. Not with fear, but with intention. You start to notice how many little moments had gone unnoticed before. The subtle brush of a hand, the sound of breath changing when vulnerability appears, the silence that holds safety, not absence. And then, like the first rays of sun after a long storm, something begins to return. But not just physical desire, a deeper longing, emotional, spiritual, eternal, a longing to be known, to be cherished, to be safe inside the most exposed place on earth, your beloved's presence. This is where we shift from survival to sanctuary, because make no mistake, the marital bed is not just a mattress, it's an altar, and every altar must be protected from pollution, not just of the body, but of the spirit. Let's talk about what happens when you begin to reclaim this sanctuary. First, the air clears, you begin to feel peace where there used to be tension, your communication improves. Your laughter returns. Your intimacy stops feeling like a calendar task and begins to feel like worship. Because when God is invited into your bedroom, not as a referee, but as a witness to covenant love, everything begins to align. But don't be surprised if resistance shows up again, because darkness doesn't surrender easily. It will test the gates you've closed. It will try to stir up old habits, unresolved wounds, or distractions you thought you'd moved past. You'll feel it in subtle ways. A sudden disinterest in your spouse, a sharp word spoken with too much heat, an urge to escape instead of engage. And when those moments come, don't panic, don't accuse, don't run, pause, breathe. Remember, this is not always about you or them. Sometimes, it's about what's trying to steal your union. The Jinn, the spirits of interference, don't always aim to destroy you instantly. That would be too obvious. They aim to separate you slowly. A touch you don't respond to it, a need left unspoken, again, and over time a wall forms, not of brick and stone, but of unmet moments, missed chances. And that's why intimacy must become a discipline, not in the boring, mechanical sense, but in the deeply sacred sense, a rhythm of reconnection, a ritual of return. Because the same way prayer doesn't just happen when you feel spiritual, intimacy doesn't always happen only when you feel erotic. It happens when you choose each other again and again, in spite of the noise. And let me say something to the men watching, because too often the responsibility of emotional connection is placed on women, while men are told to just show up. Gentlemen, your role is not just to pursue your wife physically. It is to cover her emotionally, to become a gatekeeper of peace in the space you both share. When your energy is harsh, rushed, or detached, it opens the door for disconnection. When you lead with stillness, tenderness, prayer, and presence, your intimacy becomes inviting. And to the women, your vulnerability is not a weakness. Your heart is not too much. You were never meant to shrink your needs into silence. When you speak with truth, not just about what your body wants, but what your soul needs, he listens differently, he touches differently, he protects differently. And here's something powerful that no one says. When a man and a woman love each other in full presence, not just for physical release but for soul safety, that kind of love becomes unwatchable. Yes, you heard that right, because holiness blinds the enemy. When intimacy becomes worship, not performance, the unclean cannot stay, they flee. But when love becomes transactional, shallow, forced, or resentful, that's when darkness lingers. So the question becomes, how do you keep the flame clean? You keep it by speaking openly, by asking your spouse, what do you need to feel safe with me again? Not just, what do you like, or what turns you on, but where do you still feel afraid? What parts of your heart have I missed lately? How can I hold you in a way that heals? These questions are not just emotional, they're spiritual, because they reweave the fabric that disconnection tries to unravel. And listen to me carefully, every couple will face spiritual interference, even the strongest marriages, especially the ones that pray, especially the ones that still kiss goodnight, because intimacy that honors God threatens every demonic system built on lust, shame, confusion, and brokenness. You are not immune, but you are equipped. This is not about suspicion, it's about awareness. It's about understanding that your bed is holy ground, and anything holy must be guarded, not just from external temptation, but from spiritual decay. That means paying attention to patterns that repeat. Do arguments always start before connection? Do you feel agitated right before you're about to be intimate? Do you feel spiritually distant even when your body is close? These are not random, these are alerts. But the beautiful thing is, the moment you begin to address them openly and spiritually, they lose power, because darkness thrives in silence. But love speaks. Love asks questions, love listens, love protects. And one more thing, don't underestimate the power of your voice in your space. Sometimes, the most effective form of spiritual cleansing isn't a ritual or incense or deliverance prayer. Sometimes, it's a husband and wife saying, out loud together, no unclean spirit is welcome here. This room is covered in peace. Our bed is undefiled. Our love is protected. Our hearts are one. And our intimacy is sealed by God. Say it out loud, even if you feel silly. Say it because words create atmosphere. Say it because Jinn can't read your mind, but they hear your authority. Say it because your marriage is worth protecting. This is not about living in fear. It's about reclaiming your power. The power of intention, the power of presence, the power of God-breathed love that cannot be watched, interrupted, or tainted. Because when your love is clean, when your intimacy is spiritual, and your covenant is covered, even the watchers will turn away. There's something quiet that happens when two people finally begin to trust the stillness again. Not the silence of avoidance or disinterest, but the stillness of peace. That sacred wordless agreement that says, I am with you fully, even when nothing needs to be said. And that stillness, when protected, becomes a shield. You see, not everything sacred needs to be loud. Intimacy doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it sighs, sometimes it's simply laying there together, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat, saying, we made it through another day together. And in those moments, when your guard is down, when your soul is open, when the veil is thin between earth and heaven, that's when the enemy searches for cracks. He's not after your pleasure, he's after your agreement. He wants to divide what God has made one. Because when you stop believing that intimacy is holy, you stop guarding it like it's holy. And that's when the intruders come in. Spiritual watchers, whatever name you call them, are opportunistic. They don't barge in like demons in horror films. No, they slip in unnoticed, through emotional exhaustion, through bitterness that was never healed, through fantasies left unchecked, through boredom you never dared to name. And that's why it's so essential, not just to pray over your bed, but to speak into it, to name what's there, to release what doesn't belong, to declare what your intimacy is and isn't. Your words are not just tools for communication. They're weapons of atmosphere. When you say aloud, this space belongs to love, not fear. This bed is a covenant, not a battleground. You are drawing spiritual lines that no Jinn can cross. But let's be honest, this level of spiritual awareness, this level of intentionality, it's not common. Most couples drift. Most couples assume that normal means distant seasons, sexual boredom, long stretches of disconnection. They accept the lie that passion is just for the honeymoon phase, that deep love can't survive bills and kids and aging bodies. But that's a lie from the pit of hell, because God created desire. He designed pleasure. He wired your body to respond, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually to your partner. And every time you lean into that design, every time you press past the distraction, past the fatigue, past the insecurity, you are resisting darkness. Let me tell you something most churches won't say. Intimacy is a form of deliverance, not because it's magical, but because it brings light into dark places. It forces out lies. It exposes wounds. It creates space for truth to be felt, not just preached. You can go to therapy for years and still hold bitterness. You can go to church every Sunday and still feel emotionally naked and unchosen. But when your spouse touches you with tenderness, after a season of silence, when you look into each other's eyes and choose to try again, not because it's easy, but because you're committed, that is spiritual warfare, and the enemy hates it. He hates when you hold each other without expectation. He hates when you laugh during foreplay instead of performing. He hates when you bless your bedroom instead of criticizing your body. He hates when love is whole, not perfect, but honest. Because honest love cannot be watched. It becomes too bright. Let me say that again, honest, covered, intentional love cannot be watched. It blinds the enemy. It burns Jinn into retreat. That's why the ancient spiritual traditions, even outside of Christianity, placed so much importance on prayer before intimacy. It wasn't superstition, it was safeguarding, not just of bodies, but of energy, because what happens in that space flows into every other space of your marriage. When intimacy is healthy, communication becomes easier. When connection is regular, forgiveness is faster. When affection is consistent, arguments lose their venom. Because the glue of your marriage isn't logic, it's love lived out in the physical and spiritual body. And if your intimacy has been under attack, whether through trauma, stress, lust, or just slow drift, please hear me, you can rebuild, you can re-anoint, you can reclaim. God is not ashamed of your bedroom. He's not embarrassed by your pleasure. He delights in covenant love. He blesses it. He covers it when you invite him. But here's the thing. God doesn't force himself into your intimacy. Just like you wouldn't force your spouse to open up emotionally, God waits for invitation. And when you make room for him, not by preaching, but by praying, inviting, blessing, he comes. And when he comes, nothing unclean can stay. So if you've ever felt watched, if you've ever sensed that something else is in the room, if you've ever felt that unexplainable agitation, that invisible chill, that sudden wedge between you and your spouse during a moment that should have been warm and safer, don't ignore it, don't overthink it, but also don't fear it. Instead, rise up, speak light, reclaim the air. And remember, it's not about fancy language. It's about your spiritual authority. Because you, beloved, are a child of God. Your marriage is a mirror of his covenant with the church. Your bed is not a playground for jinn or demons or spiritual darkness. It is a sacred tent where love recharges the soul. It is where your wounds are seen and kissed. It is where laughter softens the pain. It is where bodies become one in the slow, holy rhythm of safety. And when you protect that space, when you bless that space, when you and your spouse begin to treat your intimacy not just as relief, but as renewal, that is when heaven smiles. That is when the enemy flees. That is when even the watchers close their eyes. Because the light is too strong, the love too pure, the presence of God too near. There's a moment so tender, so vulnerable, that happens when two people, stripped of pretense, just look at each other, not with urgency, not with performance, but with reverence. It's the look of two souls who know each other's flaws and stay. The look that says, I see the tired in you, the ache, the wonder, the fear, the fire. I still want all of it. And when that kind of intimacy takes root in a marriage, it changes everything. It becomes more than connection. It becomes a covering, a soft, unseen armor, a warmth that goes with you through the day, protecting you from the loneliness that prowls behind busy schedules and unspoken expectations. Because now you're not just married on paper, you're one in spirit. And here's what the enemy hates most about that kind of union: it becomes unshakable. It's not fragile like performance-based relationships. It's not shallow like transactional sex. It's not dependent on perfect moods or perfect bodies. It's rooted in the kind of love that makes watchers flee, because there's nothing for them to feed on. No resentment, no jealousy, no fear, no shame. Just presence. Lagad. And when that kind of love fills the atmosphere, even jinn cannot endure it. Even demonic forces must back away from it. But getting to this place, it takes more than desire. It takes forgiveness. It takes patience. It takes courage to ask the uncomfortable questions and tenderness to hear the vulnerable answers. What have we allowed into our bedroom that never belonged there? Have we turned our sacred space into a battlefield? Have we replaced closeness with convenience? Have we made space for God or only for routine? This isn't about blaming one another. It's about waking up together, because many marriages don't fail from infidelity or abuse. They fade from neglect, from spiritual disconnection, from a slow, quiet loss of awe. But that all can be restored. It just takes a moment of bravery, a whisper of prayer, a turning of the heart. So tonight, before you reach for your phone or turn to your favorite distraction, try something different. Reach for your spouse. Not sexually, not urgently, just softly, honestly. Look them in the eyes. Ask, can we reclaim our sanctuary again? And if that feels awkward, that's okay. Love is not always fluent. Sometimes it stumbles. stumbles. Sometimes it's clumsy, but it's the reaching that counts. It's the choosing that counts. It's the invitation that changes the atmosphere. Because where two or more are gathered in His name, even in the bedroom, God is there. And when God is in the room, there is no room for watchers. There is no fear of being exposed because you're already known. There is no fear of performance because you're already loved. There is no fear of interruption because you've sealed the door with peace. That is what holy intimacy looks like. And when it is guarded, nourished, protected, it becomes a weapon, not against each other, but against every force that ever tried to divide you. So here's what I want to leave you with: simple, practical, and deeply spiritual. Speak blessing over your bed before. Even if it feels weird, start now. Ask God to show you what needs to be removed, be it a mindset, an object, a habit, or a silence. Talk with your spouse, not just about frequency or fantasies, but about fears, longings, spirit safety. Reclaim the sacred with touch, with time, with tone, with tenderness. And lastly, remember, you're not just making love, you're building a temple, you're hosting heaven. And heaven does not share space with the jinn, with demons, with lies, with watchers. So invite the light in. Turn the presence of God into the atmosphere of your intimacy. Let love be not just something you do, but something you protect, because true intimacy isn't just about naked bodies. It's about naked souls, unashamed, unafraid, and fully seen. And when two people stand together in that kind of love, there is no spirit strong enough to separate them. Thank you for staying with me through this tender and important conversation. If something in your spirit stirred, if you felt seen or comforted or convicted, take that as a divine nudge. You are not alone. You are not too far gone. And it is not too late to reclaim what was always meant to be your sacred, protected, passionate love, fully alive, fully blessed, fully guarded. If this spoke to you, I invite you to leave a comment, tell your story, ask your questions. You don't have to be perfect, just be present. And if you believe more couples need to hear this, share it, like the video, subscribe for more deeply honest conversations about love, connection, and spiritual wholeness. Because what we don't talk about is often where we're hurting the most. And I'm here to help you heal, not just privately, but together. Here's to your marriage becoming a fortress, a flame, a sanctuary, a place so filled with light that even the darkness forgets how to enter. Until next time, stay covered, stay close, and stay sacred.